We're here at Arrowmont. We're going to do some precision hinge soldering, and I've got my attentive class surrounding me. They've already made some splendid hinges. All right, so I've got a piece set up here, a silver 14 gauge, and I've got probably 2.5 millimeter tubing, and the alignment pin is an old drill bit that's been oxidized, and I've got this all blocked. I've rubbed graphite into it, and I've got either yellow ochre, kaolin, kaopectate, liquid paper as a stop block for solder. And I've done all the prep work. That's a whole other demo. I've filed a perfect groove in this tubing with a chenier file to fit the tubing perfectly in place. And here's some examples of hinges that have already been soldered. Here's I've got 3-knuckled, 5-knuckled, and there's a 9-jointed. I've got a 13-jointed hinge someplace. Some of these are cradle hinges. There's an integral hinge. So one of the mistakes a lot of people make is, especially with a 3-knuckled hinge, all the knuckles are the same dimension, they're the same length, and that makes for the weak middle knuckle. So all of these, with the exception of that one, okay, here's a 3-knuckled hinge. The center hinge, just like on a laptop computer or flip-top phone, the center knuckle is much greater than the total distance of these other two. And the other ones I've calculated so that we have equal hinge space on each side. This is a 7-knuckle hinge. There's same amount of millimeters of hinge space on this side as there is on that side. And this is the 9-knuckled hinge, same number of millimeter hinge dimensions on this side as this side. So it makes for a stronger hinge in most situations. This is all set up. The only thing I have not done is place the solder. So I'm going to do that. I've filed a groove. It fits perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and flux this and heat it up. And I'm going to start with the 2-torch method. I'll use the Gauss torch as a preheat flame, and I'll use this mini torch as a surgical strike flame. But I might, once I get started, I might just use this flame for the entire thing. We're going to see what happens. I could use this for the whole thing, but it's not going to be as precise. You'll see the flame in just a minute. So I'll go ahead and flux this, and if anybody has any questions, you'd like to all look at this. So, okay, there's the middle one and the end one. And what I'm going to do, okay, I've pinned this down on this side. What I'm going to do is the placement of the solder is important. Okay, and I'm using a thick flux that's probably at least heavy cream or like yogurt. That's a good, using handy flux, not that fluoride-free flux that burns up quickly. Okay, so I've cut solder, and what I did is I took wire hard solder and I hammered it flat to get cheap. So I just took a planishing hammer and hammered it flat and then snipped it into pieces that are about 0.5 millimeter by 1 millimeter in dimension. So I'll go ahead and place those. And for the end pieces, I want the solder to be at the very end of the tubing. I'm going to have to use tweezers for this. Okay. Oh, you have? Thank you. Okay. And my biggest problem now is just my vision. Okay, so here's a little piece of solder, and I'm fluxing the solder too. Okay, there, that's placed. And I placed it at the very end. Now, normally what people will do is they'll put it in the middle of each knuckle or chenier, but I'm going to, on the end pieces, not place them in the middle. I'm going to place them on the very end, outermost section, because that's as far away from the neighbor as it can be and still be touching the piece. So, okay, those pieces, I'm going to put one in the middle. So these 3 knuckles, this is a 5-knuckled hinge, they'll be soldered on this side. The other 2 knuckles will be soldered on that side. And the heating is what's probably the most interesting part of this whole thing, and the trickiest. And look how shaky my hands are. So if I can do this with shaky hands, just think what you all can do with steady hands. I'm bouncing them so I can identify them. Okay, there we go. Almost ready. But these are probably going to float away once the solder, once the flux melts. Okay, these are pretty large pieces. If anybody wants to come up and take a close look at that to see the placement. So there we go. These are right in the middle. Okay, so there's a piece of solder here, here in the middle knuckle, and here at the end. And then there's a piece of solder that, whoops, I just moved it, right here and right here. And what I'm going to do is tack those. And then it might flow perfectly across. I've put a solder block between the hinge knuckles. I've faced them off perfectly, and so I think we're ready to start heating. I've pinned down one side. I'm not going to pin down the opposite side because I want to test this once I think it's soldered, and if I need to, I've got extra solder cut up and I can add it. So we're ready. I'm going to preheat with this flame. Here's some pieces. I could probably move them out of the way. Now normally, when we don't have people watching, I'll build an open face kiln. So I'll take little pieces of fire brick and build around the piece. I'll do this so people on the camera can see. I'll build bricks around this piece, and that helps to trap the heat in, and it gives me much more control of the heat. But today I'm not going to do that because people won't be able to see. Okay, and the other thing I've got, normally I'll have 3, but I have 2 clean solder picks, and clean means I filed them. There's no flux glass on them. Okay, now remember the distance, the direction, and the timing are very important. So I'm just preheating right now, and the flux will be a temperature indicator. First stage is it dries. This is, okay, here we go. First stage is dry, then the second stage it goes into a syrupy state, and then it gets to be a thin, clear liquid, and that means the solder's about to flow. And what I'm gonna do is a hit and run technique. So by hitting and running, that allows, remember the big pieces heat up slowly and they also cool off slowly. Small pieces heat up really, really fast. They cool off really, really fast, and that's important to remember. So in the final stages, once this gets preheated, also my dimensions for the hinge knuckles are written down here. They're going to disappear as I heat. The hit and run technique will allow me to not overheat one piece, and I can control the solder. So as soon as that solder just melts, I'm going to take the torch away. I'm not going to leave it there letting it flow all over the place. All right, so it's starting to move into the syrupy state, and I think what I'll do, I'll go ahead and light this torch. So let's just see how this works. See how I'm angling away from the tubing? The tubing is, well, I'd say the sheet is probably 100 times larger than the tubing. I might want to use the mini torch for the whole thing. I think I'm going to have to do that because I'm going to use the soldering pick to move the solder into position. Okay, so there's an imaginary pivot point just above the tubing. Can you see? So I'm angling the flame away from the tubing and heating the larger piece without overheating the smaller one. Okay, so I'm going to place the solder. It's touching on the ends, perfect. Make sure these are touching. And this is not quite in place. Okay, it's in place. So I'm going to use the mini torch to do the precision soldering. I haven't used one of these in about 5 years. So we'll see. If it doesn't work, I'm going to blame the mini torch. Okay, so here we go. I'm using the bushy part of the flame to preheat. Yeah, this is a much more intense flame. At home I have a Swiss torch and I have hypodermic needle tips. Okay, so here we go. We're going to get this side first. And I'm really judging by color. Oops, it just jumped. All right, so I need to get that tip of that cone really close there. There it went. See it? There, and this one went too. All right, now the other side. Let me preheat. I'm going to have to add solder because I see it jumped away. There, it just flowed. There, that one just flowed. Let me add a little bit of solder to this one. I'm going to test it right now and see what. Okay, it's not soldered together. You know, it looks like it worked perfectly the first time. What do you know? Yeah, it flowed perfectly all the way across. I thought I was going to come back and add solder, but I won't have to. So.
Yay. Solder.